Hello and welcome to this third broadcast leg of our TimesLive Dialogues in partnership with the Gautrain Management Agency. I'm Joanne Joseph. Great to be back with you today. We're going to be talking about Africa's appropriateness in the implementation of technology. Now, during this discussion, we're going to get to the bottom of how ready South Africa is for digitization and hyperconnectivity, especially within the context of transport. And we'll ask, can transport be a means to pull the country out of the quagmire of difficulties created by the onslaught of COVID and other setbacks like higher unemployment and poverty? If that is indeed possible, can it be done with green technology, one of the most important imperatives for business and government in 2022? These are some of the issues I'm going to tackle with the Gautrain Management Agency's Chief Operating Officer, Tsepo Khobe, who will help me understand the thinking around harnessing technology in the transport sector. Now, do remember you can add your questions to the live chat, and I'll try to pose as many of those questions of yours to Tsepo as possible. Also, a nice surprise if you've just tuned in, we've got one 500 Rand Take-A-Lot voucher up for grabs, as well as one 1,000 Rand Gautrain card. So those are up for grabs, and we'd love you to participate, not just because the kind of subject matter that we're covering today is really interesting, but also so you can benefit from that prize. So, Tsepo, I want to welcome you to our studio this morning, and we've got quite an intense discussion ahead, given all the elements that go into smart technology.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you for having me.
Yeah.
It's always good to come through and chat with you.
Thank you. Tsepo, I'm going to start off, if you don't mind, by just mentioning that much of our discussion today centers on smart mobility. Can you start off by just telling us what's meant by that term?
So I think we have to define it clearly, and define it as we chose to define it, as part of growing Gauteng together through smart mobility, which is the province's strategy on how do we go forward from here onwards. We define it as an efficient and effective mobility system using appropriate technology. And that's smart mobility. And once you set off from there, and with appropriateness of technology being pertinent to our discussion today, because you can implement anything you want in terms of technology, but if you're not setting it up correctly and making sure that you understand the context within which you are implementing it, then you end up with a big challenge. And I think one of the best things you've raised now as you're introducing this is transport is going to be how we get out of our current economic challenges, because transport in itself is the catalyst for economic development. And with it being a catalyst for economic development, what we chose to do as Gauteng and Gautrain included was, because we worked on the strategy with the province, was that then cluster the issues into sort of 4 pillars, and 4 key pillars that talk to, first and foremost, how do we restructure the urban landform? And what does that mean, restructuring the urban landform?
We'll start with that for us, because that's an important part of it. I mean, the landscape as we know it comprises a series of disparate types of transport. Many people don't have access to transport. Many people can't afford transport. Many people have gone the opposite way to the mode of sustainability we want to introduce, and are using, gas guzzlers on the road. So how does one go about restructuring the urban landform? What does that mean?
So first and foremost is you have to understand our current urban landform and decisions that were taken before, because the reasoning why we have to be clear about where we're going is that when we chose the Integrated Transport Master Plan, the 25-year plan, we said we will continue to densify the urban core. And what is the urban core? It is actually the area that lies in and around the M2, N1, N14, and the 3 cities that are in and around Gauteng. And we choose not to build outside of that urban core. And as we choose not to build outside of that urban core, in itself, the questions that you have to ask is that if we are planning to be able to grow the economy, where are we growing it? We're growing it through special economic zones. And the special economic zones, I can list a few. So you've got in the north, you've got Motor City, which is the Roslyn area, as it's always been known. We've got another special economic zone in the Western End called the Western Precinct SEZ. And then you've got the eastern side of it, which is the area where Tambo Springs is. And then you've got Lanseria as part of the smart cities, and the Erythropolis in itself, which is part of what do they call it? What we had already started off. In the south, we then have the Vaal River City development itself. Now, when you're restructuring the urban landform, you have to ask yourself, what will happen? Do I need to now move people from where they live to where we're building these SEZs? But we're saying no. We're maintaining the urban core and then building a transport system that connects all these nodes.
Right.
An additional decision that we took when we built the ITMP25 is to make rail the backbone of transport in Gauteng. Now, in essence, we needed to realize that the extensions of the Gautrain as it is are much more important than what we had sought out to do initially.
Yes.
They now will become what connects all these SEZs. The plan has actually been rebuilt in such a way that you will have the ability to be actually 45 minutes away from any point in the whole of the province. Because a lot of these SEZs are actually built at the urban edge of what do they call it, of the province itself. And you will literally be from the urban core 42 to 45 minutes away from any point. You could live in the Vaal River City, and then commute into the urban core, into Santen and the area that we're sitting in now, and without worrying about it. Now, in essence, is then, do we use the right mode of transport? And the right mode of transport is the appropriateness of technology.
Right.
Choose the right technology for you to be able to enable you to do two things. One is by choosing not to redevelop outside of the urban core, is we're maintaining a lot of green spaces. Okay. And we're actually maintaining the ability of the province to breathe, because it actually has a lot of open lands and forests that we want to maintain, and natural areas that we want to maintain. And in that sense, we're then saying, connect these points with the fastest mode that can get you back and out as quickly as possible, and then enable your economy to run, because you are able to maintain the knowledge workers still living in the urban core, but then being able to be transported out to the SEZ and then come back in without you adding more traffic and more roads to it.
Right.
But on top of that, you'll have to do the following few things. You'll have to build freight networks, and that freight networks has to be both on rail and on road.
Am I correct in saying a significant percentage of freight passes through Gauteng anyway as it makes its way across the country? Should we be thinking more of Gauteng as a kind of freight logistics hub?
Yes, that brings us to our second pillar. Our second pillar has to recognize that probably 80% of everything that goes into the hinterland, that goes beyond even our borders, actually goes through Gauteng.
Right.
And in this small land mass, you have to think about it then, how do you manage that freight? How do you manage to understand what is sitting in freight and what is coming in? And can we actually build bypasses and additional roads that allow us not to bring the freight into the urban core? And the second pillar is Gauteng as what do they call it, as a freight logistics hub. Now, when you look at it, it has to have a very strong urban development in and around it. But in addition to that, remember we said we're densifying the urban core.
Yes.
As you densify the urban core, we also have to have the ability to be able to move our freight within the urban core itself. At the current moment, we're using the wrong modes of transport to do our last miles.
Let's stay with that idea of the last
Yes.
mile, because William Dax brought that up in the conversation as well. Many people are not familiar with that term,
Yes.
but we now understand it to mean, the Gautrain, for example, gets you to a certain point, but that last mile, that last little stretch home,
Yes.
is what we're talking about when we're talking about the last mile, and people don't always have a way of accessing that. So just explain to me, how would you go about jacking up services on that last mile that can be the one deterrent to people using the Gautrain, for example?
So when you think about it, I had to go for what do they call it, to give a speech down at Auckland Park. And I knew there was a BRT station there, but I could not recognize how to find the means and where do I connect. So where will I take my, so I knew I can get to Park Station with the Gautrain, but I know that the Gautrain buses don't go out there. Now, how do I get there? Now, in essence, it's about you. So first and foremost is your first mile is the first important one. So your decision making, so nobody thinks of their trip in bits and pieces. You don't go, well, I'll go to Arena House today, and then once I get there, I'll figure out what I do later.
Yeah.
You go, okay, I have to go to Arana House, I have to go to a meeting in Santene, and then I have to go back to the office, and then I have to go home.
Right.
Now, the minute any of these links, you cannot recognize where the transport is, then you have a problem.
Yeah.
And the biggest challenge with the lack of use of public transport is the inability of people to be able to access the information. And accessing the information, I mean, you have had some of my colleagues that have spoken about, you know, the digitization of ticketing and also of other things that we're bringing into the city. But you gotta go back to what the problem is. In essence, at core lies the fact that you cannot find the information.
Yeah.
And once you cannot find the information, what is the most natural thing you're going to do? You're going to take your keys.
Yes.
And which is the one thing we're trying to get you out of. And get you into public transport. But people won't get into public transport first if they cannot figure out their first mile. And then the minute they cannot figure out their last mile, because the first mile tends to be very easy.
Right.
I'll drive to a Gautrain station, and then once I've driven to a Gautrain station, then I'll take the trunk, which is the Gautrain itself, and then the bus might get me close enough to where I'm going. But if, what do they call it, if I cannot figure out where everything is, and this is where probably let's deal with this third pillar before we go to the second one that I was dealing with earlier on. Now, data-centric mobility becomes important. And when you're talking about data-centric mobility, it's the ability for you to be able to, one, give people information about where they need to go. And that first mile is enabled by that data-centric mobility. It's about having the right apps, having the right websites, having the right ability, and in addition to that, having the ability to make the information open. And that's when we start talking about open data. And when you start talking about open data, is we recognize it is not in our role as, what they call it, as government to build apps. Open markets out there, what they do is they make their data open. There is data that is accessible to anybody who wants to build apps. And there is probably hundreds of apps in, what they call it, in Transport for London, which are actually based on the logic of the people who will build the apps themselves according to the logic of how they want to travel. We will make sure that Gauteng on the Move comes back on stream, which is our local app, is what they call, that has been built by the department. And with that, you'll be able to say, well, I need to go from my house to Auckland Park. And it will give you three options. One with a minibus taxi, one with, what do they call it, with a bus, and then one with a train. And as we add additional modes of transport, which is urban scooters, those three-wheel scooters, electrical ones for that matter, and buses, electrical buses, all of that will be brought on. But it's about us thinking differently about how do you give people information, and give people information to make their own choices. And if I decide I don't want to take any mode of transport that is polluting, then I can be able to say, no, I actually don't want to take a scooter that is polluting. I want to take a scooter that is electrical. And therefore, you start choosing your mode of transport that you want to go with.
You know, you're mentioning a very interesting thing here. I mean, if we look at the kind of courier services that exist now, most people, many people I know, are buying online right now. And there are a couple of ideas tied to that. I mean, firstly, I'm one of these people who finds it quite annoying when I have ordered a number of products online and the order is delayed simply because two of those products, for example, are not available. And so I will have to wait maybe 2 weeks longer or a month longer to get my parcels. I mean, clearly that last mile issue becomes a problem for companies that cannot afford to be spending money doing multiple trips because of the transport modes they're using.
Yes, you're using the wrong mode of transport for your last mile. So those buckies, those panel van buckies that are always in such a hurry that they look like they're going to run you over all the time, because they're trying to fit all the days, what do they call it, delivery in them. But let's think differently about freight. And think about it is, what if you created local freight depots? And those local freight depots, Take a Lot has already started. I mean, we work with them, and we're even giving away one of their vouchers. They've started with localizing freight depots. But every other freight company has to do that. Take the freight depot into the local community where it is, and then from there, distribute to the houses in the right mode of transport. If you were using e-bikes or electrical scooters to do that trip, it doesn't cost as much as you lugging about a 2-ton bakkie back and forth. Now, you spoke about, what do they call it, about the issue of pick-up and drop-offs, the click and collect mode that we're in now. It has been shown that 74% of all baskets online get abandoned because of the long lead time of the last item that you've ordered. So all freight companies deliver on the basis of the last item to be delivered. So therefore, they don't have to go back and forth between your house. But if they then enabled a smaller mode of transport to deliver with, then they can do the 2 trips without worrying about lugging this 2-ton bakkie back and forth from your house to what do they call it. But if they localize the, what do they call it, the freight depot, then you are able to then get it closer, get it quicker, and using a smaller mode of transport, you can create jobs.
Absolutely, yeah. That is an interesting point to me, the kind of spin-offs of localizing many of these services and bringing, people who would not traditionally have been involved in the chain, like your scooter driver,
Yes, we have to enable the scooter drivers and even e-bikes. I mean, you see the way they get used in, what do they call it, in places like New York and a lot of the international cities, where you've got these guys that are just riding their hearts out to be able to deliver parcels. And I think there was even a movie made out of that, which was quite interesting to watch. But when you get to be able to understand that, there's a whole lot more people that can be empowered. But behind that, there needs to sit another issue. And we go back to what? To data-centric mobility. You need to be able to enable an individual to see their parcel.
Yes.
And then to be in control of when the parcel gets delivered. You know parcels, they work in mysterious ways. They always show up when you're not there. And by its nature, we're not like any other city. I mean, in other cities, the package gets dropped off on your door and your doorstep. It will stay there until you come and pick it up. Not here. Here, anything that gets left off by your gate and looks sealed, you're not going to find it when you come back. So by its nature, we then can make sure that you then are in control. When you're using an appropriate mode of transport for freight, then you are in control. Then you can say, I'm home. From your app, say, I'm home to take a lot. And then take a lot then activates the nearest, like, when they do any other, what do they call it, food or anything of that sort, you say, I'm home, and then therefore, the scooter guy leaves to come and deliver your parcel.
Right.
And it can be done back and forth. And this is us now rebuilding the construct of how we do freight and making sure that in the last mile services of freight, we think differently about it and actually enable more jobs.
Right. I want to ask you about this because this concept around the customer having control, being able to track their parcel in real time. There's a little bit of movement to that, in that area amongst 1 or 2 companies, but it's not working really efficiently at this time. So we've got very congested highways. We've got people returning to the office post-COVID, and there are particular constraints for couriers right now. Just talk me through this issue of tracking your parcels in real time, ensuring they're delivered at the correct time, and also ensuring that we've got the right skills to make sure that all of the software can be built.
Yes. So we now build up to, what do they call it, to our 4th pillar in the strategy itself, which is strengthening our institutions. And when talking about strengthening institutions, I want to bring it down to its basic form or its granular form. It's us having the right skills in the market to be able to, one, the coding has to be built up.
Yeah.
And then ultimately, the ability to design beautiful apps. There's nothing I hate like, what do they call it, like an app that has a bad user interface.
Yes, absolutely.
It drives you nuts. And it has been shown that, what do they call it, statistically, the apps don't get used because they have a bad user interface. Now, you need people to be able to have the graphic design skills to be able to design, proper apps, and then also similarly make sure that the coding that sits behind it is there. But in addition to that, then you need a platform that sits behind all of that, or an API, an applications programming interface that then allows that, what do they call it, those apps to be plugged in. into the data lake that you need to be able to have all of this data in it. And these data sets can then be extracted by the app. Now, when we build stronger institutions, first and foremost is, one, you got to have government institutions that can direct the strategy of where to go.
Yeah.
And then secondly, you got to have a private sector that is also willing to bring up the skills in the market. And we've done very well, but we've also been very slow about it. I mean, when you look like places like the Innovation Hub was always there to make sure that these skills can be built up. And smaller companies that need to be incubated in the technology space can be built up. And the ECAC labs that were built by, what do they call it, by the Innovation Hub, the students there get snapped up before they even finish their term.
Yeah, so
because
the demand is great.
The demand
already.
is extremely high.
Yeah.
But it also happens to be a career option that is closed down to, what do they call it, to a lot of kids. If you ever spoke to any matriculants right now and you ask them, do you want to go into coding? None of them would say, well, very few of them would say yes, because they had been made aware of this as a career option. So we need to actually build up all the institutions academically. Government institutions have to be built up to be able to think this way. The options, the kind of software engineers you're pushing out of universities, are they ready to actually enable this digitization that we want to?
Well, are they ready? Do you have a sense of that?
Not really. I mean, a lot of, what do they call it, graduates when you get them. I mean, I've been working for probably 23 years. A lot of graduates, when you get them, you'll have to break them down first to rebuild them so that you can use them. And no offense to anybody. I mean, it's the key challenge. I mean, I've been training engineers and what do they call it, and tech people for years. And you find that a lot of them, you have to rebuild the way they think. And a lot of academic institutions are not emphasizing the issue of being able to think in a structured manner. They are pushing out these cookie cutter type degrees that do not enable a lot of these kids to think in a very structured manner. And that's why I say most of the time you have to break them down and then rebuild them properly. Their skills and the basic skills that they come with are useful, and I'll say that.
Yeah.
But the ability for them to hit the ground running when we're building apps and all of that, and also to think like the customer. Because one of the biggest challenges you get with app developers is they build apps for app developers.
Yeah.
And you look at this thing, you have to have what do they call it, a degree in rocket science for you to use it. And it means it's an app for app developers more than anything else. So you gotta think differently about how do you build, first, the ability to think in a structured manner, and then secondly, then to be customer facing, to think of how is this thing going to be used.
Yeah.
And you know very well, Joanne, when the first banking apps were released, those were horrible.
Absolutely.
You couldn't find
Some
anything
of them
on them.
still are, Sipho. Some of them
Okay.
still are.
I've only been banking in one place for a very long time. So it is what do they call it, a big challenge to be able to think of the customer. Think clearly of how you build your apps. And then, in making sure that as we build stronger institutions, then as government, we know our role. We have the ability to stand back and enable the market to build the apps. And then you bring up the open data issue and make sure that people have access to the data where they can build the apps for transport. They can build the different bits and pieces of what you need in the ecosystem. It's an ecosystem rather than it being a technology edge that single businesses can use. Now, when we were having an earlier discussion, I did say to you, there are companies out there that are actually saving money from using technology appropriately.
Right.
If you had to think about it, most trucks that are with you in the middle of the morning commute, they're just this, thousands of tons that are burning fuel in the middle of the freeway.
Yeah.
Now, if those companies actually started moving those trucks at a time when it's low traffic and it's not peak traffic area, a lot of the companies internationally have shown that they've saved more than 40% on their logistic costs alone. Now, if all the companies that need to deliver and deliver to their stores, deliver to their local depots, freight depots, deliver to their main warehouses, we're actually delivering at an alternate time
Yeah.
and not going in the middle of traffic.
Yeah.
Now, that is part of smartness. That is part of us thinking differently about how we push, what do they call it, how we manage freight.
So I want to talk about this in a very structured way because
Yes.
I mean you've got so many options that emanate out of the kind of policies you're looking at. You spoke first of all about the open data policies.
Yeah.
We know these are on the cards; they're yet to be passed. But what will these policies actually allow developers and business people in general, as well as government, to be able to do?
So on any open data policy, you've got multiple stakeholders. So from a government perspective, you need the data for us to do correct planning.
Right.
That's the first line of it. And then at the level of the operators, any operator, be it a freight operator, a public transport operator, they need data for them to manage their day-to-day business. They have to be able to locate their vehicles. They have to be able to have the right telemetry on those vehicles to be able to understand how much fuel is in that vehicle, what is the health of the vehicle in itself, and be able to communicate back and forth with the driver and be able to reroute them easily when they have challenges. And then from a public perspective, then there's an ability for you to be able to access this data to make sure that you can make your own movements as you wish. And then from a transport management center perspective, then it's the overarching management of transport as a whole.
Right.
Now, all of those, what do they call it? All of those stakeholders, they have a window to that data. They don't have the entire data lake, but they have a window to that data. And that window enables them to do what they need to do. And through that, open data policies allow you to regulate what that window is and what operators can see, what the public can see, what app developers can see, what government itself can see, and ultimately be able to, or what academic institutions can actually be able to access for them to do their modeling, to do, high-level planning.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So we haven't actually spoken about the Transport Management Center that I understand is coming online later this year, but you spoke about this kind of ecosystem that is going to be created, hopefully, and I take it that will fall under the Transport Management Center, and it'll be the kind of hub where you bring all of these elements together.
Yes. So the Transport Management Center in itself, which we were due to open it, we are actually due to open it soon. The actual building fit out has already been, will be completed in April, and then the technology will probably be fitted in full somewhere around June. It's due to the delays that have happened with all the procurement challenges in government. We were geared up to be able to open now in April, but it is what it is, and we will have to deal with the procurement challenges as they are. Now, the Transport Management Center in itself, let's define it. It is the central point that all transport data will come into. And all of that data will then allow us to be able to manage. And somebody would think, why would you do that? And I'd give you an example. When the bridge fell on Gauteng, what did we do? We all have Google Maps in our pockets, but we all drove to the same point where traffic wasn't working. Now, it's because one of the very few things is, as you live here around Kilani, there isn't a variable message board that tells you that you shouldn't be going in that direction. Or the data in itself would have been uploaded to any other software, be it Waze, be it Google Maps, from the Transport Management Center, we are able to start directing traffic in the whole of the province in such a way that we get it away from the point where what do they call it? Where you need to push out emergency medical services. You need to push out, people,
Metro police
Metro police and everybody else. But all these people needed data for them to be able to reroute themselves the right way. And also the commuters and everybody who was traveling on the day, they didn't know what was going on. We were all working on hope. It says, no, the traffic will clear. It's Gauteng. It normally jams up for a short while. But some people spent 3 hours on that queue trying to get there. And then what ended up happening is that they started spilling out into the suburbs. And the roads in the suburbs, the arterial roads filled up there. And then the next set of roads filled up. And ultimately, it was just a pure mess in and around this area here. And also coming up from Pretoria, it was a big challenge. because then you were not sure about the data. It's ultimately when now the new services can now report clearly, such as yourself, then people could be able to hear on the road that don't go in that direction. At that point in time, it was too late.
Right.
Now, if you have a transport management center, or if we had a transport management center at that point in time, we would have been able to have a coordinated response. And with a coordinated response, what that makes sure is that you clear the road for what they call for emergency medical services, and what do they call it, and metropolis, to be able to go and attend to the scene and redirect everybody to go in an opposite direction from where they ended up going. Now, in essence, a large economy such as ours. And remember, we are 37% of South Africa's GDP. We are the sixth largest economy in Africa. And that's only this little landmass of Gauteng.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, is that you gotta keep people going. We're an important part of, what do they call it, of the economy of the continent as a whole, not only of South Africa. Now, through that, then the Transport Management Center will then ensure that we have constant, proper flow of traffic in and around the city. And people can actually be able to have services that you find in very expensive vehicles. A lot of the high-end vehicles will immediately recognize there's a challenge on the freeway, and then redirect you to say, no, there's a challenge on the freeway, off-ramp, or there is a challenge on the freeway, but we still recommend that you continue in that same direction. And that kind of a service, you'll actually, through the Transport Management Center and the apps that we're putting out into the market, be able to access it from any smartphone.
So that's another question I wanted to ask in terms of the mechanics of it.
Yes.
If I'm using Waze or Google Maps and I'm not using the Gauteng on the Move map, app rather, am I still going to be able to access that information?
Yes, John. That's where that's why the open data policy is important, because companies like that have developed Waze will then be able to have the same data, so we will all have a single source of truth about the traffic of Gauteng. That in itself, that will enable anybody to be able to build an app or plug into the data. Because in most cases, when you have a proper API, anybody can plug into the API to be able to extract what they need. Because you don't need everything that is sitting in that data lake. Because in that data lake, we'll have all sorts of data. We'll have the transport data. We'll have emergency management services. The health data will sit in there. The education data would sit in there, and a lot of government services data will sit in there. But it's the manner in which you will extract the data, which then can go into any app. And that's where open data policies actually function better, because you allow the market to actually proliferate the apps, rather than you being the one who's trying to figure it all out. And apps by their nature, the number one rule of apps, of building apps, don't hang too many things on it. And if you build an app, a super app that then has everything on it, what happens? You end up in the same point where we were with the banking apps. Because all banking apps that were pushed out right in the beginning, they were all trying to be everything to everybody off one platform. And that is the number one rule of building apps. Don't hang too many things on it. And it's got to have a core of what this app is intended to do. And therefore, you then allow multiple, people can be able to access different information from different apps, and in addition to that is that there's also the issue of democratizing data access in South Africa. There are certain services, I'll be honest with you, I'm not the most popular person about talking about this, but there are certain things we're going to have to democratize. And as we democratize technology, we have to zero rate certain services that have to access data. And that zero rating of certain services means that things like you accessing a transport app, which then allows you to access data from the TMC, you can't charge people for that. The ability to access, where there's a hospital, we can't charge people for that. Things like that have to be zero rated. And mobile network operators have to think differently about these things, because it is an essential services that we have to put out there. And therefore you can't be having people, we'll put all this digital capability out, but then suddenly people cannot access it because it requires us to have data. to put it out there, or for the people to access it. So that's part of the conversation of us modernizing mobility as a whole. The zero rating of what they call it, of certain essential services such as transport, health, education, and all of that.
I want to take a slightly different tack now and talk about this issue of clean energy. I mean, the Gautrain we know is, or the GMA is certainly committed to going green and finding all means to remain environmentally sustainable in the years to come. I understand you were faced with a choice recently of purchasing reasonably priced diesel buses for Gautrain, and these were to come from Europe, and they would have been fairly cost effective. But I understand you declined that. And could you explain why?
So part of what we'll have to do as we build stronger institutions is actually build a technology map behind this plan. And that technology map, then it's a strategy that then guides you where you're going. And at any point in time when you have to make a purchase, you have to think 3-4 steps ahead of where you are. And when you've built your technology map and your technology strategy properly, then you have to recognize, I intend on going electrical or even hydrogen at some point in time. Now, if I bought this bus now, what does it mean for me to get a new one later on? Now, if that bus was not able to be easily converted into an electrical or a hybrid bus and then an fully electrical with batteries, and then ultimately our dream of having hydrogen buses in the order they call it on the streets, then you've made the wrong choice. And your technology map guides you because that is your technology strategy. And in essence, when these buses came up, they were fairly cheap and they look like a good buy. But when I asked the simple question, how much is it going to cost for me to convert them into electrical? I was told it could be as much as buying a new bus.
So it wasn't cost effective?
It wasn't cost effective because like literally,
in the long run.
We have a rule on the Gautrain, no bus can be older than 10 years that is in service. Now that allows us to keep the buses fairly new. And that means in 10 years' time, after buying the current buses, I would have had to completely, without being able to overhaul that, buy new buses again. Now, the current buses that we bought them on what's called the integrated bus platform. The integrated bus platform enables us to go back into those buses, take the current power pack, so the engine, the diesel engine that is in there, and then replace it with an electrical motor and either a hybrid system that fits the electrical motor, or full batteries, or ultimately get up to what they call it, to a hydrogen bus. We actually have the logic of going in that direction because the platform is ready. And that has allowed the technology map for us to be able to align back with our technology map and say, in 3 to 4 years, that we have the ability to actually be able to take out those diesel engines and fit electrical motors in there with batteries and everything else and go in in that direction. We do have an intent of getting out on the market with a set of test buses that will be fully electrical.
Right. And that'll happen in the next few years, presumably?
It will happen soon.
Okay.
Yes, I'm not putting a date on it.
Okay, no, I'm glad to hear that, though, Tsepo. Let's talk about some of the other environmental issues that you're facing right now. You're grappling with the single ticketing system. I mean, well, what challenges does that pose to a company that's committed to going green?
So the single ticketing in itself, we are going with account-based ticketing. And we've gone, the current system on the Gautrain is account-based ticketing. And let's define account-based ticketing. Account-based ticketing says, we are agnostic of what media you're using for you to pay us. All we have to know is that there's an account behind that media that then we will get money from, that will pay us as we render our services. Now, what that means is then, it then means you can bring your watch, your smartwatch, you can bring your phone, you can bring anything else that is what they call digitally enabled. You can even bring your credit card, or what do they call it, a preloaded data card that then, or debit card, that then can then be able to tap the system. Now, what does that mean holistically? Now, we have some of the operators in the province that probably carry at most 100,000 passengers what do they call it, a day.
Right.
But they have in excess of they estimate 3 to 4 million cards that have already been issued to the market.
Wow. That's an environmental nuisance,
That
clearly.
is a big environmental nuisance. There's
Yeah.
all these small plastic cards that are either polluting your wallet or you've thrown them away and they are now become part of what do they call it, the landfills
landfill,
themselves. Now, when we go with account-based ticketing, we're going towards the logic where we're not issuing cards. Yes, going back to the definition, efficient, effective mobility system using appropriate technology. You also have to recognize the context within which you are implementing all of this. Because in South Africa, we talk about the unbanked. We talk about, the secondary economy that actually the money moves through there where it doesn't move through the normal electronic systems. Now, that you also have to recognize that you will have to cater for that market because that's also the market that tends to commute on public transport more than anybody else. So therefore, there's gotta be a balance between going fully electronic ticketing with account-based ticketing without issuance to where you're saying there will be some level of issuing. And therefore, as what do they call it? As times change, and times have changed. I mean, there's new mobile, manufacturers that are manufacturing devices that can, be bought for very little or for a smaller amount than, the very high-end devices.
Right.
Now, what that means is that we're getting a much more bigger penetration of smartphones in the market, and that would allow us with the other issue of zero rating of data to be able to enable people to access their accounts and be able to have their devices communicate back and forth with the central system in the transport management center and in the, what do they call it, in the ticketing. That then will mean that as time goes, we will phase out the issuing of cards. But we've also chosen a secondary issue. All cards that will be issued as part of the single ticketing will be biodegradable. Will be made out of what do they call out of polymers and materials that can easily degrade rather than making them out of that hardened plastic that probably will take millions of years to degrade, and some of it is not even recyclable.
Right. I'm interested in that because, of course, I mean, you're giving us examples here of how education can be stimulated, the private sector gets something out of this, government certainly gets something out of it, most of all the citizens benefit from all of the innovations that you've been speaking about via digitization. Are there international precedents, especially post-COVID, where countries have been severely hit, cities have been severely hit, but they've been able to use these smart mobility technologies to bounce back?
Yes, when you look at what do they call it, so we look to probably 3 cities in the world as we rebuild our what do they call it, our logic of how we what do they call it, how we commercialize our business, where we look at the Gautrain as a whole and think of its logic. We had to look at who's the best at doing this and who has done it best.
Yeah.
And we first looked at MTR, and that's Hong Kong. And they've done very well in making sure that the technology enables them to bring back their commuters as soon as possible. Obviously, the Hong Kong city does not work without its public transport. So that in itself, it's an upside on their part. And then we also looked at what do they call it, at Metrolinx in Toronto, who are the new kid on the block in what they're doing, because they are expanding their city. And they have a similar, what do they call it, type of a setup as us, where they've got Toronto sitting on the one end, and they've got the suburbs having proliferated in the northern end of, what do they call it, of that Ontario area. So they have to link up those places together with the central business district. Now, we also looked at Transport for London. Transport for London has been at this for 10 years, and we had to see how they use the information and the ability to digitize to be able to bring their customers back. Now, first and foremost, a statistic that we need to put up front. Rail services around the world globally have shown that they have been lagging in recovery, probably 30 to 40% behind all other modes. So all other modes, that's like the buses, the taxis, and everything else, had easily bounced back. And rail services themselves globally have shown that they haven't bounced back to their pre-COVID numbers.
Right.
And we are comfortable with that. But what lies at the core of, what do they call it, of those who have bounced back easily, such as the Chinese markets and all of that, is that they were able to give their commuters the kind of information that they need. They were able to, what do they call it, to advise their commuters in let's give you a simple example. As part of the redevelopment of the Gautrain app, we're going to put a crowding, an overcrowding mechanism. So what that allows you to do, it allows you to be able to choose when you want to ride. So you then go, and another rule of building apps, it must always be in 3 clicks. If you cannot get to anything in 3 clicks, that is a horrible app. Now, in essence, based on the 3-click rule, is that the first click is you'll say, you've opened the app and it says, when do you want to travel? So that's the first thing that will come up on that area. And you say, I want to travel at 7 o'clock. And then immediately after you've put the 7 o'clock in there, the app will say to you, no, that train is full. We suggest that you travel earlier or after that.
Right.
Now, literally in 1, 2, 3, you already have what do they call it. And then you then click the one that you want to travel on. Through that, what am I doing? One is I'm able, so originally when we built this, we were building it for, what do they call it, for social distancing purposes.
Right.
And one of the things that we've learned to do, and we were quite agile about it, is for us to not develop for COVID purposes, but develop for disruption.
Right.
And develop, and that's that lifetime evolution that you have to think about when you develop your apps and you develop what you, your digitization. You gotta think forward beyond such things as COVID. So in actual fact, ultimately when we asked ourselves, what does this app do? We recognize that it manages overcrowding. Yes, initially the overcrowding lies in and around the social distancing portion, because then we are able to, using the lower rates of carrying people in the train, I'm able to say, no, that train is full. It might not be physically full, but we recognize that social distancing might not work in that train.
Yeah.
But later on, when we're back to where we're running at 100% and everything is done correctly as we were used to, then you are able to say, okay, I want to travel at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and I go home. And we immediately in 3 clicks say to you, no, if you travel at, what do they call it, at 2:45 or at 3:30, you will be better off and you will be able to probably be guaranteed a seat on that. But we go further than that. In actual fact, once you have clicked the travel time that you want to, the minute we're watching the train and it starts filling up, we give you an alternate advice. Because, and that allows the information to be dynamic.
Yeah, and current.
And
so
current. And that's what is important. A lot of apps are abandoned in their use because the data, so you're beyond the fact that you have to use your own data to go back and forth between you and what do they call it, and the API itself, is that the secondary issue then becomes that the data, once you have it, is not as current. So from the minute I say I'm going to travel at this time, and then later on something happens in the office and I end up in a meeting, what do I still have? I still have the data that I had requested.
Yeah.
Whereas dynamically, as the app is watching me, have I traveled, haven't I traveled, and all of that, then it is able to say, okay, this is an alternative travel time. Because all apps have to auto-geolocate. And once it auto-geolocates, it then recognizes where you are currently. And then, by its nature, with it recognizing that you're not at park as yet. It's now 3 o'clock when you said you're going to travel, or quarter past that you said you had agreed to traveling, but you haven't moved. So then it then updates the data to be able to enable to move at the right time.
Yeah. You know, I just want to ask you one last question from my side before we start taking questions from our viewers, because there are quite a few, Tsepo. And this is a last bit about you focusing on the younger market, or even, I mean, my generation that's tired of running to the shops all the time and so on. I mean, COVID has made us lazy to do these kinds of things, and I'm not that broken up about it, quite frankly, to now be able to sit in my home, order my groceries on an app and have them delivered to me. You've started off with the licensing centers at certain stations. Are you taking that click and collect concept any further?
Yes, it is important that we recognize that the DLTCs are not just what do they call it, something that just happened randomly because there was an opportunity. It is actually part of our commercialization strategy, which talks to retail plus amenities. Now, every time I ask a young mother, why would you not, what do they call it, take the Gautrain? She always says, well, one of the first things is the school run is in the opposite direction. And later on in the evening, I have to go to the shops. And, you know, and all of these things. And then I have to do my hair, I have to do my nails, and also other things. Now, what if all of that was at the station? Now, the question that comes up right now is that, there isn't that much investment money to build large buildings anymore at the current moment with what do they call it, with the property market as down as it is. But could we actually make those services into smaller containerized, buildings that are built on alternative building technologies? Now, what if you sat in right now here and you were able to do all your grocery shopping, and then you get to, what do they call it, you get to the station, and all you do is you come and show your QR code to the scanner, and all your groceries are loaded up into your vehicle without you even ever leaving your vehicle at all.
What a joy.
Now, that is what, in addition to the DLTCs, will be bringing on a click and collect services, and those click and collect services will have diverse, what do they call it, retailers on there. In addition to that, while you're waiting for your groceries to be loaded up, you will end up with a bit of a queue there, but we guarantee you'll be out of there within 10 minutes, within 10 and 15 minutes. Similarly, with our DLTCs, we guarantee you that you'll be out of there in less than 15 minutes. And that is service, and you are now thinking differently about enabling a retail arm of our business that we would have waited probably a few years that the property market recovers, but we're actually implementing it now. And what that will bring, it will bring you the ability to be able to pick up your, your take a lot at the station, pick up your Woolies at the station, pick up your, Checkers, and what do they call it, and Pick and Pay, and all these other retailers, and also pick up your, what do they call it, if the child has the sniffles, then you can pick up your medication that you've ordered online from any of the pharmacy companies. That will then bring us to a point where now people get to a point where they regard transport as a lifestyle product more than anything else. Because at the current moment, transport is a utility rather than it being a lifestyle product.
That integration is going to become so important, particularly with our younger generation. Putelo, who is a regular viewer of ours, and I don't think has missed a single Gautrain broadcast. I look forward to hearing from you, Putelo. Thank you. Says China successfully trialed buses powered by green hydrogen during the Olympics. When you approach Johannesburg from the north of the country, a layer of smog is visible. The adoption of hydrogen buses can address the smog over the long term, can't it? Or will
it? I am in full agreement. And in actual fact, the only thing that is prohibiting me from implementing hydrogen buses, it's the cost. So the cost of a hydrogen bus, it's 3 times a normal bus at the current moment. So a normal bus, low-floor bus, in and around the 4 million rands mark. For a new hydrogen bus, you will be talking at 12 million rands.
Okay. And someone else asks, what has been the toughest technical challenge the Gautrain has faced?
The toughest technical challenge?
I don't know whether that refers to a physical technical challenge or a digital challenge that might spring to mind.
Look, at the current moment, probably the toughest technical challenge is convincing everybody that the system is safe and has remained safe as it was from all the hype. Every time we go into a wave, everybody starts thinking of their own health. And I'll give you an example. So at the current moment, the freeway has breached its pre-COVID numbers. So in essence, we've reached a point, but you ask yourself, where is this traffic? All that has happened with that traffic, instead of it getting all traveling at peak, it now travels the entire day. So if you were to stand in my office and look out at the freeway is full the entire day. Now, that is telling you that is the most inefficient way for us to travel as a province in itself. But everybody is still in the mode where they're thinking of their own health and safety and all sorts of other things. And I think for us, we are getting there, and the numbers are coming back up again. And we are working on making sure that, what do they call it, everybody is well aware of our system and how it's functioning and how we will remain on the top of our game the entire time. And I'd say that has been, probably the last 2 years have been challenging in terms of ridership. But to be honest with you, when it comes to technology and what do they call it, and all of that, we've always erred on the side where we hire the best people. And an old boss of mine used to tell me, you hire the best people, the rest of it takes care of itself.
True. I've got a question around freight. I mean, we spoke so much about that a little bit earlier on. Is there ever going to be a time when Gautrain carries not only passengers but freight as well?
Joanne, that question was what do they call it? Was brought up. I think it was in 2014 when I came back to the Gautrain again, because this is not my first stint at the Gautrain.
Okay.
When I came back to the Gautrain, now the biggest challenge that we had was always the fact that because of the speed at which we move, everybody wanted to move high-value items on the system. And the challenge with moving high-value items is that you also increase or you change our security profile.
Right.
Or our security risk profile. So in essence, then the talks fell apart because we were now insisting on, the size of package that can be carried and also the type of thing that can be carried and the manner in which it must be carried. And the manner why we need to be able to specify this is that my primary product, which is the commuting of the commuting of people from one part of the province to the other, has to remain intact. It has to remain as good as a product as it is today. Now, I cannot allow a secondary stream to actually make somebody who's a normal commuter become uncomfortable because now we've changed our security profile. Every time they see somebody from one of these companies carrying something, they're thinking, are we going to end up in a space where this person gets robbed or something of that sort? So that in itself, we eventually got to a point where, the size of how the packages must be carried and all of that was agreed upon. But we couldn't agree on the security profile and the issues of the items that cannot be carried on the system. And ultimately, it is always an area that we can always reopen and have a conversation about it. Now, long-term wise, when it comes to technology, you got to think differently about it. Now, modern future trains actually will have a compartment in between the four cars. You'll have a compartment where you can actually carry that. It doesn't have any doors or windows on it, but it's attached to the normal commuting cars, and that will allow you to be able to carry even motorbikes, bikes, and and all sorts of other things, and allow people to not. Right now we specify that your bike must be foldable for you to be, or it must be in a bag. So with that kind of a coaching between the four cars, then you are able to carry freight in locked cages and then because it's not with the rest of the service, then it will allow us to carry that. But that is when we change our fleet and look at going to the next iteration of the fleet itself.
Right. So for just a final question for you that pulls it all together. I mean, before our conversation, even though I read quite a lot, had not really thought about transport as a means of social upliftment, lifting people out of poverty, job creation, and so forth. How serious is Gautrain and government about using this as a means to change the fortunes of people in a province where people have been very hard hit by unemployment and by poverty in general, particularly post-COVID?
So we cannot do this without changing, the challenges that we have. I mean, you drive down the M1 and the different sides of the M1 are completely different from each other. Somebody said, at some point in time, the poor will have nothing to eat, but eat the rich themselves. And we don't want to get there. And we've seen what has happened with the riots in the last year and the challenges. So the socio-economic strains that are there have to be part of how we create jobs, have to be part of how we think about transport itself and how it enables change. Mobility has to enable business to grow. Mobility has to enable business to grow so that it can create jobs. And mobility has to be built into the lifestyle of the people. And mobility in itself has to be part of how we actually make this economy work. But beyond that with mobility there's so many projects that we have to do. There are so many roads that still have to be built. We have continued for the last 25 years to build houses every time away from transport. It's about time now we build everything closer to transport. And that is us thinking differently about the relationship between transport and the urban landform. And then secondly, we have the ability to make sure that people can travel as they wish and as they want to, through enabling them to access data from their apps and their phones And through that is we're harnessing the issue of hyperconnectivity and digitization. With all the pavements that have been uprooted, with all the fiber we're planting into the ground, that's got to come to some benefit of sorts to a great degree. And ultimately, we have to bring on new skills. This economy will not be rebuilt on the old skills. And transport is at the center of how we bring on new skills and capabilities into the economy, but rebuild the entire economy of South Africa in a different manner, and ultimately in using digitization to create new skills, new jobs, and new meaningful jobs. Not just what do they call it the old way. I'm not saying we're going to undo the old jobs that were there, but they would become more limited, and we need to bring on more digital-based economy jobs.
Tsepo, thank you so much. You've honestly given us so much food for thought there, and I really appreciate it. And thank you for joining us today for this fascinating discussion on how important smart mobility could become as Africa prepares to enter the age of digitization on a much more significant footing. Now, it's clearly all about building transport into the life of the people and not the other way around. But hyperconnectivity and digitization will be central to this process that hopefully plays a pivotal part in lifting our province's population out of poverty. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. Thank you to the Gautrain Management Agency and TimesLive for making this discussion possible through their partnership, and a special thank you to our guest, COO of the GMA, Tsepo Khobe. Don't miss our final conversation in the series next week. Take care. From me, Joanne Joseph, it's goodbye for now.